Joel Mokyr has this year been awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences, endowed by the Central Bank of Sweden, for having identified the conditions for sustained growth through technological development. In this 2010 interview, Mokyr reflects on the course of economic progress from the dawn of capitalism in the 17th century to the modern age.
Professor Mokyr, as I understand it, when you teach your class, you don't use the word capitalism. Why is that?
Well, I'm teaching mostly economic students, and odd as it may sound, economists tend to shy away from the term capitalism, I suppose because economic fancies itself to be a science, and capitalism is a political value-laden term that you either like a lot or you don't like a lot. Of course, we economists, somewhat, I think, vainly pretend to be apolitical and scientific, and so we don't want to use value-laden terms. So we like to use terms like, income per capita growth, GDP per capita, capital-labor ratios, demographic change. We talk about factor substitution, things like that. These are all sort of so-called neutral terms. Capitalism is something that you either love or you hate, but almost nobody's indifferent to it. And since we're supposed to be scientific, we stay away from the term. I must say that in my waning years, I'm probably ripe for revision on that score as well. So I'm actually glad here to be asked that question, and maybe I'll rethink my teaching vocabulary.
But as a system, whatever you call it, it's operated for, say, 3 centuries, 2-3 centuries. Take us back, if you would, to the beginning. What happened at the beginning, which resulted in something called capitalism, free market, whatever you might call it?
Well, people probably would differ exactly when the first time when capitalism emerged. It isn't like Christianity or Islam, in which it's sort of somebody once they say, let's start this, and then he had disciples, and the disciples had more disciples, and eventually it moved. Capitalism wasn't like that at all. Obviously, it started in certain areas and not in other areas. But it's fair to say that, around the time of Queen Elizabeth I, that is. It was reasonably
16th century,
late 16th, early 17th century. It is a system that can be said to be in place in certain parts of Western Europe, particularly in England, in the Low Countries, in some portions of France, in northern Italy, parts of Germany, and so on and so forth. Now, it involves certain elements that aren't shared by everybody, but essentially what we're looking at is a system in which markets and well-enforced private property rights come together to create a mode of production that's different from what there was before. And it involves certain institutions that are, some of them are new, like joint stock companies, maritime insurance, things like that, or if they had been around, they come out in transformed form. But essentially it means the commercialization of economic relations, both in the markets for goods and services and in the markets for capital, labor and land, which eventually become more and more market-oriented. But I don't think that's enough. You need some system of property rights that backs it up. And that seems to be in place in these countries, say, in the beginning of the 17th century, although its grip is far from unshakable at that time.
So that, I think, when you're teaching class, you use the analogy of Microsoft. And yes, that's Microsoft 1.0.
I would say that is probably the very early version of capitalism, which then is eventually transformed and retransformed and adapted to changing circumstances.
So what is the next big move, if you like, the big change that happens?
Well, for instance, this system itself, of course, has, much like Microsoft, it has, patches and updates all the time because things are, and not all of these patches work all that well. I think what happens is that early capitalism gets captured often by special interest monopolies in particular, or organizations of workers like guilds, who try to actually subvert the free market in their own favor, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less successfully. So you might call that even capitalism 1.1. But it's clear that in the middle of the 18th century, thereabout, first in Britain and then in other countries, we see the biggest transformation of Microsoft, and that's where maybe we go from something like MS-DOS to Windows, or maybe that's pushing the analogy a little bit far. But in any event, what happens is what we call the Industrial Revolution, and at that point, capitalism becomes less about commerce and finance and more about what Schumpeter called creative destruction. It becomes increasingly technology directed. And so that technological innovation, invention, increases in productivity, properly speaking, become the focus of capitalism rather than foreign trade and domestic trade and handicraft manufacturing.
And this, as you say, begins in England, but spreads fairly rapidly
in
Britain.
I might
but it spreads fairly rapidly to continental Europe, to North America. I mean, what's the rate of its diffusion? How quickly does it become more of a global system than a national one?
Well, it does eventually do so, but actually that diffusion takes longer than one would have thought, in part because what comes in between is the war. So between 1793 and 1815, we have to remember Britain and the continent are at war with each other. And of course, the movement of people and ideas and machinery is severely impeded, in part because the war actually became pretty nasty and it actually deliberately tried to impede the flow of people and goods between the warring sides. So I would say it's not really until after the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 that the continent seriously begins to realize that they have fallen behind Britain and that they should do something about it. And for the next, I would say, 30 or 40 years, there's a catching up process in which Britain moves ahead, but the continent is trying to catch up. I think the full catching up of the process really isn't in high gear until the second half of the 19th century. And of course, eventually Britain loses its status as the first industrial nation and becomes one of a somewhat larger club of nations that included Germany and France and the United States and Switzerland and Scandinavian countries and so on. But it's still a small corner of the world. But within it, Britain, which had been the leader for something like, I'd say, at least a century, certainly on the eve of World War I, it's become one of many.
You used the phrase, the Schumpeterian phrase, creative destruction. What is being destroyed by it? What was being destroyed? Was it the peasant economy, a series of relationships, both economic and social, that were being destroyed?
Well, all of the above and more. What is destroyed by creative destruction? Creative destruction basically is the introduction of new technology that wipes out whatever was there before, okay? So the typewriter and people who knew how to use it were made obsolete by the introduction of word processing, for instance. Okay, now some people could adapt, okay, but they had to switch jobs, they had to learn new skills. It wasn't like you knew how to use a typewriter and now you can use MS Word. They have to learn new skills. Some people can do that depending on age and education and so on, some people can't, okay? But clearly the old typewriters now have been creatively destroyed. They're relics, okay? So now cross out typewriter and write handloom. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution basically, say, by introducing mechanical weaving, this is in the 1810s and 1820s, basically made hundreds of thousands of handlooms in Britain, museum pieces, and the people who knew how to skill them either had to learn new skills or else basically they were out of luck. And that's, of course, a classic example of what we mean by creative destruction. Now, what happened was true for handloom weavers, was true for literally scores and scores of artisans and handicraft workers whose skills eventually became unnecessary because they were being replaced by machines. So some of these people in the end found jobs in the factories, others migrated to America, still others eventually became part of some unemployed proletariat and fell back on the poor rates. I mean, there's no telling, but clearly there was a cost there.
And when you say became proletarians, became the working class, you then got the formation in Britain, first of all, and then elsewhere, of an industrial working class, which itself then, as it began to realize more of its power, began to protest as reformers complained about the conditions in cities and so forth. That then also, did it not, change the nature of the market, of capitalism itself?
I would say so. So what happens is that until the middle of the 19th century, capitalism 2.0, which is sort of the one that was created by the Industrial Revolution, is very much focused on free markets, open competition and laissez-faire, as little government intervention as possible. And then I think, maybe a little bit before that, but more and more after the 1840s and 1850s, people start seeing the warts in the system that they developed. Child labor, unhealthy cities, the plagues of urbanization, crime, on and on and on. And so then there is slowly a dawning of a sense that this system needs to be amended. It needs a patch, to use the Microsoft analogy. And the patch is introduced in some countries early, in some countries late. Oddly enough, in Britain, it's actually occurring fairly late. I would say it's probably not really fully implemented until Lloyd George and the People's Budget of 1906. But that's sort of very early beginning of an interventionist state, which makes sure that not only that children go to school and that we have a military, but that lots of social provisions are being taken care of.
You have it earlier in Germany and Scandinavia.
You have it earlier on the continent. Oddly enough, some of these countries introduced. Germany is, of course, a pioneer in the matter in the Bismarck reforms of the 1880s, but it's true even in the Netherlands and in Scandinavian countries. Britain follows in the beginning of the 20th century. America is by far the last one on that account and really has to wait until the New Deal, until any of this is implemented in a serious way. And even then, it's sort of not fully done, one would argue, until the present day, if you really push me on it. But it's basically behind everybody else. But the recognition that capitalism cannot really be allowed to rely entirely on free markets, I think, is there already from John Stuart Mill onward, and it's just a question of how should we do it. So some people want to have liberal reforms, others want to have socialism. It's not, apart from the extreme Marxist view of socialism, I think most socialists wanted to retain capitalism, but in a modified form.
So these were social democrats, but then, of course, you go east and rapid industrialization, immiseration, and so on, as well as losing the war, causes a revolution in Russia.
Yes, and of course in Russia it's the first time in which instead of reforming capitalism, they throw it out of the window, and they try a different system, which is not window-based, and it's really not part of its problem, not the only problem, but part of its problem is not compatible with that of the rest of the world. And so one of the things that does that system is that the rest of the world and it really don't communicate, and so the Soviet Union becomes far more than they should have been, a closed economy, unconnected to the rest of the world, losing out in large parts on the information and communications revolution of the 1970s and 1980s, which is at least to some extent, I think, responsible for their eventual demise.
Which causes the crisis.
Yeah. Capitalism, on the other hand, is perfectly capable of continuously adapting, reforming, and reinventing itself. And I think,
and that is going back to the earlier years of the century, of the 20th century. In America, you have very vigorous capitalism after the war, huge growth, enormous stock price rises, and then suddenly the Great Depression, the crash and the depression, and that too must be a large change in the fortunes of this thing. We don't know what we call it, but let's say capitalism.
Yeah, and so what happens in the interwar period is that capitalism comes under a terrible shock. You could argue that World War I was not an economic shock, it was a political shock, it was a military shock, and it was really sort of unrelated to capitalism, although most Marxists would disagree with that. But clearly the great collapse of 1929 was an inherent criticism of capitalism. And the question is, or was at the time, does this mean that capitalism cannot survive? And lots of people, asked the question, can capitalism survive? And the answer was no. Also, their reasons were different. Schumpeter basically thought, capitalism wouldn't survive because it would be taken over by bureaucrats. Other people felt that capitalism couldn't survive because it would never have enough employment and aggregate demand to make sure that people were fully employed. Against those, rose a group of Keynesians. I'm actually hesitant to add Keynes to that equation, but certainly the Keynesians, his followers, both in Britain and the United States, who basically said, look, capitalism can survive. The only thing we need is a slightly updated version in which the government doesn't just make sure that children go to school and that they don't die people don't die in mining accidents and so on. We also need a government that makes sure that capitalism will guarantee full employment. And that's easy to do because we can play with government budget and we can play with the money supply. And so a combination of fiscal and monetary policy should keep the capitalism alive and well.
This is the New Deal in part?
This is, no. I would say this is post-New Deal. This is really the post-1945 Keynesian consensus, as reflected in the Full Employment Act of 1946.
So the New Deal is something different. The New Deal is kind of more relief-oriented.
The New Deal is, in many ways, pre-Keynesian. And I think most economic historians today would think it's, it was a very, very partial success at best. And some would go beyond that. In fact, there are economists now who believe that the New Deal made things worse. Though Roosevelt was not a Keynesian. He maintained balanced budgets and he didn't quite understand exactly macroeconomics, which is, not a terrible thing. Very few people understood macroeconomics. Arguably, the only country where it was slightly understood was here in Scandinavia, where in fact a government followed much more responsible fiscal policies than elsewhere. And as a result, the Scandinavian countries were touched relatively lightly by the Great Depression, say, compared with Germany or Czechoslovakia or other countries. But in the United States, the notion that the government would have to run fiscal deficits to keep the population employed really only came through in the post-World War II years.
Just before we go on to that, I mean, at the end of that period of the 30s, you then have the Great War. You have some of the greatest powers in the world were not at all capitalist, or at best were very tightly controlled capitalism. They were either communist, like the Soviet Union, or fascist, like Italy and Germany, and indeed other states. So it seemed as though the free market allied to free societies, democratic societies, was on the defensive then. The war changed that. Is that right?
It's sort of an interesting question. I've never been able to quite exactly decide whether World War II capitalism was on one side or the other. And that is because what you have is this strange alliance of liberal capitalist countries like Britain and the United States with non-capitalist countries like the Soviet Union against these sort of fascist capitalist countries like Italy and Germany. We should always remember that in Germany, Nazism did not abolish capitalism, but actually went to bed with it. Okay, Germany did not, unlike the Soviet Union, did not confiscate private property. It did not really have the kind of planning that we see under Stalin in Russia. It is true that the heavy hand of government was felt everywhere under the Nazism, but private property was not confiscated unless you were Jewish. The big companies remained in private hands, and actually many of them made a large amount of money during the Nazi regime. And so the odd thing is that capitalism proved itself to be so adaptable that they were even capable of adapting themselves to a totalitarian fascist regime like in Germany. Some of the big American companies like Ford Motors and IBM are famously allied with the Nazi regime, and in Italy things weren't very different. So much as it's maybe embarrassing to admit, capitalism was perfectly capable of finding itself in alliance with fascism.
Right, not with communism, but with fascism. The war changes that. At least in some of the Western countries, Britain and America too, the pressure is for a more advanced, more interventionist, more total welfare state. And again, Britain probably in the lead in trying to create one.
Britain probably, and what symbolizes all of that is the Beveridge Report. The famous Beveridge Report, written by Lord Beveridge in 1944, if I recall correctly, basically saying, we should have a welfare state in which the state makes sure that we end poverty, we end ignorance, we end squalor. There were a few other things, but basically this was a prescription, a recipe for what we would think today as a welfare state in which we keep private property intact to some extent. Even so, some parts of the economy, like the automobile industry, the mining industry, could be nationalized, but we leave considerable amounts of property in private hands. But otherwise, the government will be big brother who looks over capitalism, makes sure it behaves properly, and doesn't do anything that the government doesn't approve of. So it is not, by any sense, a Soviet state, but it is clearly the most interventionist that capitalism can become, while still remaining capitalism. And yet, it seems, oddly enough, to have worked extremely well, because the 30 years after World War II, as everybody knows, were years of immense economic growth and success. Living standards increased prodigiously everywhere in the West. The French refer to it as les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And in Germany, this is the Wirtschaftswunder, you know, the economic miracle. These were years of extreme success in which a coalition between government, private enterprise, and don't forget labor unions were able to create this covenant in which everybody would benefit from economic growth. And from the government making sure there's a big safety net. And this seems to, and certainly by 1970, nobody thought there was a cloud in the sky and that this version of capitalism would work forever.
So what happens? What cloud comes on the sky?
Well, a bunch of things happened. The first, of course, is that economic growth slowed down in the 1970s from 4 to 5% a year to under 2%, and that hurt. Unemployment went up, whether this was the oil shock or some other things, people were still not in full agreement with it. But clearly the system was seen to be increasingly inefficient. Too many people were getting a free ride, too many people were taking advantage of the system, and so there was a general sense that we needed to, the pendulum needed to swing back in the other direction. We needed to re-privatize, we needed to reduce government intervention, cut government budgets, cut taxation, and in some sense, you know, this has become associated with the Thatcher-Reagan revolution in the UK and in Britain, but in fact similar things were happening all over the continent, including here in Sweden, in which things were being re-privatized, and we felt that, you know, the supervision by government on capitalism had gone too far, and it needed to be reined in somewhat. Now, nobody was proposing to go back to the bad old days of the 19th century, but I think there was some sense of government had gone too far, and the welfare state had exploded. And this is not a Republican issue in the United States, because in fact the biggest reforms to the welfare system were introduced by Bill Clinton.
And a democratic administration.
Absolutely. So this is a general feeling.
Right. But that too then worked very well. There was very strong growth in many countries. It seemed as though that too had given the elixir of almost permanent new life to capitalism. But in the last 2 or 3 years, we've discovered that may not also be true.
Exactly. And so once more, capitalism hits some kind of a crisis. And this is sort of the dynamic of it, okay? It works well for a few decades. Then it hits a crisis and it sort of scratches its head, and wise people sit down and say, well, we need to reform the system, and there's some trial and error there, and we shouldn't be in the illusion that this is smooth and clean. Not at all. Lots of mistakes are being made, lots of stupid things are being said and done. But eventually, they get it right more or less, okay? So it's an evolutionary process in some sense, okay? We never have a perfect world. We just have a world that's well enough to operate, okay? And I think that's the secret of capitalism.
That it's so flexible.
But it is flexible. It can reinvent itself. It recognizes when things don't go well, so it can reinvent itself and come up with new solutions. And so far, that's worked for 300 years.
So we don't know yet. I guess it's too early. We're still in the crucible, which is forming perhaps a new form of capitalism, but we don't know what that's going to be.
We don't know
other hints about what it might be, do you think?
Well, it seems, just reading the tea leaves from across the Atlantic in Chicago, is that there is a clear sentiment, both among intellectuals and policymakers, and among the population at large, that we want the government to regulate certain sectors of the economy which have shown that they needed it. Above all, of course, the financial sector, which clearly has, by all accounts, somehow gotten out of hand and needs re-regulation. Now, how and to what extent that has to take place is clearly still open for discussion. But it's worthwhile pointing out that even some of the architects of the new laissez-faire approach in the new economy, including the current sort of chief advisor to the president, Larry Summers, were among the big deregulators in the 1990s, and now sort of admitted that to see the errors of their way. I mean, of all people, Alan Greenspan, the former chair of the Federal Reserve, has basically admitted that he went too far in believing in markets and that some measure of regulation is necessary. So if Alan Greenspan admits it, clearly there is a large number of others who are sort of rethinking. And in some sense, I like that. I think the fact that they're admitting, yes, the system isn't perfect, we need to change it. That is, of course, what makes capitalism so powerful.
Let me just, in the last couple of minutes, go sideways a bit, because we haven't brought in what is now shaping up to be the biggest capitalist country in the world, China.
Yes.
The irony, of course, is it's governed by a one-party communist state. I mean, do you see in China a different kind of capitalism, something which will become perhaps more pervasive in the world, or is it, in its own way, following the tracks that have been already laid down?
Well, much as I hate to contradict my great teacher Milton Friedman, who everybody acknowledges their teacher and basically everybody disagrees with, capitalism and democracy do not imply one another. Okay, China, much like the case I mentioned earlier, is a country that is not democratic. It is in some ways totalitarian, also not in every way. And it's sort of, maybe we need a redefinition of totalitarianism. But clearly, it does not qualify as a liberal democracy in any shape or form. And yet, it seems to be quite compatible with capitalism. So capitalism can adjust itself to non-democratic environments. We've seen that before. We've seen that in countries like South Korea in the 1950s, Taiwan, and about the same time. These were all basically military dictatorships in which they, which didn't look at all like liberal democracies, but in which free markets were allowed to operate under the close supervision of the government, to be sure. I think China is another example of that, and that, to some extent, is workable. The question is, for capitalism to be really creative and to be really successful, it needs to innovate. And innovation requires more than just property rights and free markets. It needs, I think, an open market for ideas in which anybody can come up with a new idea, no matter how crazy, no matter how heretic, without having to worry about persecution, okay? Because what innovation is you have 100 crackpots running around with insane ideas of building machinery and gimmicks and whatnot, 99 of which don't work.
So that is the large question. Can it happen in China? With that large question, I'm afraid we're going to have to draw to a close. Professor Mokyr, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.